We have what promises to be quite an interesting program for you tonight. We're going to discuss neither the Super Bowl nor the impeachment beyond the statement that we're not going to do them. As I go around the table, I'm Arch O'Reilly, as I always am without fail. Sitting behind the keyboard is Michael Sallin, hunting between the keys to find a tune. Next to him is Kira Miner. And joining us this evening is Robert Deshay. Robert comes to us because he is Susan Harrington's brother-in-law.
Yes.
And we had an occasion to meet him at a quite lovely and appropriate service for Susan's mother, who we told you last week had left us. She didn't really leave me because she didn't know me, but in any case. And we got to talking about the fact that Robert's father was with the 333 Field Artillery Unit in Wereth, Belgium. Mm-hmm. Is that pronounced correctly? Or what? Wherewith, as in wherewithal, right? Wherewith, Belgium. This was during the Battle of the Bulge, December 1944, and his father's battery, there were 5 batteries in total, or 4 batteries in total?
Yeah, 4.
His battery was ordered to stay behind while the other batteries were told to withdraw. And they stayed behind basically to give fire support to other troops that were withdrawing from the Battle of the Bulge. Unfortunately, their service battery ran into the SS, and 11 of them were simply massacred in the fields. But Robert's father, also Robert Deshay,
yes,
and the surviving half of his battery, mm-hmm. Was actually captured and marched off into Germany and became, as Michael used to be fond of saying, guests of the Third Reich. You've heard some stories from Michael's experiences as a guest of the Reich and the difficulty of being a Jewish guest of the Third Reich. And Robert's stories are of the unique and equally unfortunate of being an African-American guest of the Third Reich. So we're expecting that Michael and Robert will trade reminiscences and stories across the generation. Before we do that, however, and almost unintentionally in a similar note, I'm going to ask Kira to do this week's necrology.
Thank you. All right, so we lost, you already pronounced this one for me, my apologies. I want to say Jan, but it's not Jan.
Jan Hoyer-Wall.
There we go. He's the children's, he died at 87. He was the children's author of Pleasant Field Notes.
Field Mouse. And a number of other stories, but he won a Pulitzer for that. So
nice. And we lost Harlan Anderson at 89. He was the co-founder of DEC.
Digital Equipment Corporation.
There you go.
At one time, the largest mid-computer company and probably one of the largest employers in Massachusetts at one time.
Wow.
Yes, I remember that.
What's the name again of the company?
Digital Equipment.
Oh, yeah.
I
read about it.
Their credit union is still going strong.
Yeah.
Okay.
Even though the company isn't.
Nice. We also lost Mary Higgins Clark at 92. She wrote suspense novels.
Oh,
Yes.
boy.
We all have read at least one.
The Queen
Maybe
of
not all of
Suspense.
us, but then we had lost John Andrade, the son of Mario Andrade, at 56. We don't know exactly what. We lost Harriet Frank at 96. She was a screenwriter. She wrote HUD and Norma Ray.
Marvelous.
Yes.
Some
Excellent. What was
marvelous.
HUD?
Yeah.
HUD. HUD was a very famous Paul Newman
Okay.
movie. What we have here is a failure to communicate. the
That was the prison one.
Yes, yes.
Yes, but what was the name of that?
HUD.
Was that?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. I would never have remembered that name associated with that movie under any
You remember the movie?
Oh, absolutely.
You remember the name, you just never put them together.
Nope.
Correct? So,
Well, good to know. Thank you for teaching me something.
such as it is. So before we went on the air, Michael and Robert were comparing notes on the Epicurean delights of POWs. Robert was saying that his father lost about half his body weight in the mere 4 months that he was a guest. And you were talking about the virtues of potato peel soup.
He mentioned it right off. and also cabbage peels. The
Oh,
peelings.
cabbage. You
Yeah.
get cabbage.
They gave us that once in a while if we didn't bomb them.
And you have said before that the Russians ate worse.
I would say so, yes. I don't know what the heck they ate.
Michael tells stories. He was in a camp that was divided in half, and half was allies, what we Brits and Americans and some French and one thing and another, and then the other half of the camp was Russians, and they were treated very differently, to the extent that the Allied prisoners had a tendency to sneak food to the Russians
Oh, I see.
because they were feeling sorry for them. But you say that your father found an ally for curious reasons.
Well, yes. He had to endure with the other white as well as black prisoners that were marched from the Ardennes back into Germany and across Germany to the Berga GI death camp. They had to endure the, shall we say, the accolades and cheers of the villagers in the various German communities that they had to pass through. But once they were in the Berga camp, which was known as a death camp.
Is this Bergen-Belsen?
Yes.
Yes.
And this was a camp that was dedicated to working prisoners until they died with a minimal amount of nutrition or care.
Maximum work, minimum expense.
Yes. And so my father told me about the potato peel soup. And he said there was a special bread that really wasn't bread. He said that he thought it was made out of sawdust.
Yeah, sweepings and
Yes.
so forth.
And but while in the prison, because he had been separated from other black POWs who had, I don't know how they dispersed them, and he wasn't sure either, but he found a particular guard who was intrigued with his ethnicity and his complexion. My father's the same, I am the same complexion as my father. And there was this one particular guard who would come, well, when he first met my father, he came over and he was checking to
See if it came off.
Yes, to see if he was, as we were talking
fascinated.
before, a special night fighter
Yes.
and ethnically engineered or genetically
Engineered secret weapon.
exactly, precisely. And when it didn't, come off, then he was intrigued to the point where he would sneak an egg to my father every few days. And that's one of the things that helped.
kept him alive, probably.
Right. I mean, my father was very appreciative of that.
Why not?
And he was appreciative, my father was appreciative of the compassion that he received in that not so compassionate environment.
Did he remain, just curiously, did he remain fond or unfond of eggs the rest of his life?
Oh no, he was very quite fond of, yes.
He was fond of eggs.
Yeah, he was quite fond of eggs.
I ran my best friend's campaign for president of Uganda in 2001, and it reminds me of all the little kids who would come up to me and do this.
Oh, because they
Because
had.
in Uganda, they wanted to see if this would rub off.
I hear you,
You know?
yes.
So, it doesn't really matter what your difference is. Difference is, on the good side, intriguing, on the bad side, terrifying. You know?
Yes.
Yes.
And if it was more intriguing to more people than terrifying, we'd be a lot better off.
Well, we would. I
Agreed.
mean, that's one of the issues that we have today, more so than anything else. The inability to deal with the paradox of difference. It's one of the things that, you know, just drives me bananas sometimes, is that inability. I mean, I come across people who, and not to digress too much, but I come across people who have criticized me. These are other black folks who criticize me for not being in unity with them. And I have to talk with them about the fact that uniformity is not unity.
It's part of the problem, but they think because you look like them, you should agree with everything they think.
Exactly. And that's not, and I also explained, you know, I grew up in Savannah, Georgia during the midst of Jim Crow, so that I was exposed to, thankfully, some of the most negative aspects of the segregation culture, but I was also exposed to some of the most beneficial aspects of the segregation culture as well. And consequently, I understand that during that period of time, the power of the civil rights movement came not from its uniformity, but from the fact that it reflected a diversity within the black community that allowed a debate and a discussion that was never totally in agreement across the board, but that forced a negotiated diplomatic settlement as to how things should proceed.
You needed Martin, and Malcolm.
Exactly, precisely. And you needed people who, like my grandparents and my parents, who were not supporters of integration. They were supporters of desegregation, but not supporters of integration.
That's what we had in the Boston public schools, desegregation.
They're different concepts, but
Does that mean that they would have fought for better funding for black schools instead of integrated schools?
that's why
Possibly.
from 1920 through the 1960s, my grandparents and my parents, first my grandparents, supported all of their children going to Catholic schools in the South, segregated Catholic schools in the South. They would prefer to pay tuition, the property tax associated with their living, but also tuition, uniforms,
Yeah.
books, lunches, because my grandfather would say, you know, we're not putting our children in the hands of people who hate them. So our nuns and priests came from Ireland.
And the irony of that is that was exactly the same thought process as the enemy was thinking.
Yes,
You know,
yes.
that's the white citizen council schools and etc. It was basically the same logic.
Yeah, there is a, and I didn't mean to take this discussion in
No,
that.
that's all right. We flow here.
We're open to whatever. No, it's fascinating. I was trying not to interrupt. I had follow-up questions, so
It's, I lost my train of thought, I'm sorry.
Well, the last thing we were talking about the education and the fact that your family, you know,
Desegregation.
your family went to Catholic schools, so they felt, I gathered, that they had more control
Exactly.
what their children were taught and the atmosphere in which they were taught. And it's ironic because in the North, you think of sending your kids to Catholic schools as a white nationalist attitude.
Really? Let me see what. Elaborate.
The
just.
Catholic schools, Catholic schools were the mechanism by which white flight left the Boston schools overwhelmingly black.
Okay.
Because the white kids were who were fleeing to the public schools.
Private schools, you mean?
To the Catholic schools, fleeing the public schools to the Catholic schools. And the thing is that you rarely saw a black face in a Catholic school around here. I mean, I was in a lot of Catholic schools talking to classrooms, and I didn't see. Now is different. Now I go to Catholic schools. Henry Knox, goes on History Slam to Catholic schools, and I've got to have Phyllis Wheatley with me because most of the kids I'm talking to are black. But now, to spin back to where we were a few minutes ago, did your father tell any stories about liberation from the camp and what happened afterwards?
Not too many.
Really?
See, my father was never totally forthcoming about his experience. He would tell.
Not unknown.
I was saying nobody. I don't remember a single person who was actually forthcoming fully about that experience.
No, they wouldn't.
Not a single person.
They wouldn't. We didn't even know that he was in a combat unit until I was in my 50s. My father died when I was 16. He was 43. In those days, there was no consideration of PTSD.
No.
Okay, and even though he went to the VA hospital,
Shell shock.
Even though he went to the.
even though he went to the VA hospital, the VA really found it difficult to believe that he was in a combat unit and that he was actually a POW. Being in Savannah, Georgia, I thought it was a racist reaction. I didn't realize until Vietnam that the Veterans Administration was less than ideal in terms of the services that it provided to
Anybody.
well, but I didn't find that out until I knew people who were veterans of Vietnam. And then I could say, oh, that wasn't a racial issue that my father encountered. That was just the standard provision of non-service.
Yes.
It might have been a bit of both.
Yes.
And politics enters into all of this.
Don't let him off the hook quite that
Yeah,
easy.
this was but he would not give us a complete story. He had 2 Purple Hearts, a bunch of ribbons. If you asked him about the Purple Hearts that had his name on the back of each one, he would say, well, that was a mistake.
That was a mistake.
Yeah.
The mistake was I didn't duck in time.
No, they don't feel like heroes.
The mistake I've come to understand over time is that he survived and his comrades didn't.
Yeah, no, that's a very common reaction.
Yes, and when I was I think I was close to 60. Our granddaughter was in 1st grade, and she was doing a project for Veterans Day. And she wanted to know, for her project, all of the people in our family that had served in the military and served particularly in war. So we have quite a legacy with regard to that.
Goes back a ways.
Oh yes, World War II, Korea. My brother-in-law, who was on a carrier, the Enterprise, a red shirt, handling some of the most dangerous materials, loading planes and stuff like that with bombs and napalms. I have a cousin who retired after several decades. There are a number of people. So I'm researching what I know for my granddaughter. And
That's good.
and I have my father's designation from his gravestone. He's buried in the Beaufort National Cemetery in South Carolina. And so I was, okay, I'm gonna look this up and I'll let her know. And when I looked it up, I come across a notation about a monument in this village in Belgium that the villagers had constructed themselves in recognition of the support and cover that they received. It turned out that my father's unit that he was involved in combat, that he was involved in hand-to-hand combat up until they ran out of ammo, that the villagers were very appreciative of the fact that the returning Nazis weren't able to get to them, because when the Nazis came back, they were executing the civilians because they were upset at the joy and celebratory attitude of the villagers when the Allies drove them out and into. So when they came back, they were fairly hostile and homicidal.
Sounds like they weren't dissimilar to the impotus.
Yeah.
You know that Franklin D. Roosevelt's wife had a big hand in getting an Air Force training base for black pilots set up in Tuskegee.
Tuskegee, yes.
And we had a reunion, like my bomb group, and we had flown with those fellas.
The Tuskegee Airmen.
Yeah, the Tuskegee Airmen. And they knew our squadron symbol, and it was a lot of fun being with them. And they would tell us stories. A few of them had been shot down, and how they were treated by the big question was, how you've been so mistreated in your own country, how can you go to war defending America, that kind of thing. And
Yeah.
they had the answers, and the Germans didn't like their answers. They told us about a lot of this.
That paradox continues to this day.
Oh yeah,
But
I
that's-
left it open for you.
No,
Run with it.
that paradox continues to this day. Yes, there is a loyalty, a love, a dedication, a fierce understanding that regardless of how African Americans are treated in this country, this is where we belong. There is
Home
no
is home.
There is no
Home is home.
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly. And there are opportunities here that are not available in a lot of other countries. And we can see it in the number of immigrants that come here. I worked as a real estate development director for an Indian-owned company in Texas for 14 years. And they came here, even with their South Asian background, even with their British mindset. You know, they come to America because there's some things about our system that allows them to express who they are, engage in entrepreneurial activity.
And rise.
I'm sorry?
And rise in our
Precisely. Because
system and
otherwise,
program.
they would be in London or Sussex or Middlesex or whatever, but they're not. They come here. There's something about capitalism and the ability to express oneself entrepreneurially that draws immigrants from all. That used to be a part of the African American experience as well, until well, there's some voices in our community that are not exactly
peaceful.
they haven't adapted You know, I mean, 50 years ago, protest was the thing. 50 years ago, being loud was the mechanism. There's this idea that being loud and boisterous and intrusive and oppressive is power, without understanding the kind of mentality that those of us who were raised in the Jim Crow South, being quiet, pursuing your objectives, not necessarily
Raising.
alerting everybody about what you're doing, because you're really dedicated to accomplishing that without being disturbed, disrupted, or whatever. That's something that's been missed, although there's some people who understand its importance. But anyway, that's
Well, it's a debate. It's a debate forever. I mean, you know, it's sort of a universal debate in this situation. I mean, this was the debate between John Adams and Sam Adams.
okay.
You know, Sam Adams was the rabble rouser. He was the guy who turned the dock workers and the apprentice boys on the British and caused the Boston Massacre. John Adams, every bit as much of a rebel, every bit as much of an independence person, defended the British soldiers from the Boston Massacre. You know, and you know, was never seen marching in the streets. You know,
Right.
So, you know, it's not unusual. You know, on the other hand, as we commented before, we needed Malcolm as well as Martin, because people were more receptive to the quiet, reasoned approach when they saw on the horizon the opposite.
Well, that's true. But
You know, they one is clearly better. We can argue which one, but the thing is that they enforce each other.
one of the things that you have to deal with in that kind of strict dichotomy is the fact that there was another way as well. And that's the way that I was just talking about, the way that we Southerners managed ourselves in the midst of some very oppressive conditions, but it never intruded on our loyalty to the country,
Oh, yeah.
on our loyalty to serving, on our loyalty to...
I grew up halfway of what you're talking about, because I grew up in St. Louis, Missouri,
Okay.
which thought of itself as a southern city, but was too far north to be genuine Jim Crow. So
You said that you got good things out of what we would perceive as bad, like life lessons
Yeah.
that came out of that takeaway. So can you share some really quickly as we're running out of time? Like, what are positives where I would be like, oh my goodness, that's oppression, and you're like, no, this is a great thing over here. Can you share something?
Well, it's about courage. It's about perseverance. It's about focus. It's about a work ethic. It's about the things that I argued with my grandfather about. If you want something out of this world, boy, you're going to have to work 3 times harder. So, well, why should I have to work 3 times harder? Well, because that's the only way you're going to get what
And
you...
for women, yep.
What you...
Yep.
I said, but that's not fair. Well, who told you equal was fair?
Lesson learned.
how many of us had our parents or uncles or grandparents tell us, who told you the world was fair?
You know,
The
exactly.
world is not fair.
Right across the board. On
Exactly.
things. So, ladies and gentlemen, this has been our interesting special edition of the Fun Show here at Big TV. Robert's going to go back to dear old Texas.
Yes.
And
There's a country for you.
and his seat will be filled next week by Susan. We wish you all a good time, a pleasant beginning of February. Enjoy the weather while it holds, and good night from the Fun Show here at Big TV.